enjoy the class.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. I'm Wally Fu here, and Linda is our featured speaker about the 3 books. It's called White Privilege. The 3 books, Bobbsey Twins and the Scarlet Raider, as well as the Book of Christmas in the Big House. Linda has received her bachelor's degree from Hope in, well, I don't want to tell them the years. And then she went on to Chicago, University of Chicago, and got a PhD in literature, English language. And she taught in various colleges. And most recently, she was at University of Cincinnati. And she retired from there a few years back and is now living in Harlem. And I'll turn it over to Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Wally. It's nice to have everyone with me on white privilege in 3 children's books. I think that I said in my email that we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about white privilege in theory. It's all over the news. Everyone encounters it all the time. And I feel certain, if you don't agree with me, speak up, but I feel certain that everyone in the class wouldn't be here unless they had some understanding of what we mean by white privilege. And the interesting thing will be to look at the books themselves and gradually elaborate what that might mean and what it means for us in the 3 books. So let me go to the PowerPoint that I prepared to start, and we'll share that. There we go.
Looks great. You just
All
need to
right,
go into presenter mode. You probably
let's
just want to go click from beginning as
All
your,
right.
yeah, right
Oh,
there.
there we go. Okay,
Perfect.
now I'll be able to advance it with the, yeah, okay. The 3 books for children, 1942 for The Land of Cotton. The edition we'll be looking at was published in 1957 with a few changes, but it was originally 1942. Then The Scarlet Raider came out in 61 and already hit a 2nd printing indicating popularity in 1962. And Christmas in the Big House, Christmas in the Quarters came out in 1994. One of the questions I'm going to have for you is which of the 3 of these is of greatest concern, of concerns you might have about where white privilege is showing up in a way that we worry about in books for children. What does white privilege mean? It means sins of omission as well as commission. It means pictures can often convey more than texts. It means usually the publishers and editors are editing the books and choosing the authors with some white privilege precepts in mind. If whites are not at the center of the book, it'll automatically very often be considered a book on a sensitive subject. I own a book published in the 1950s for children called Anatomy for Children. And it's such a hilarious book because in that book is not a single picture of the human body. Not one picture of the human body appears in a book called Anatomy for Children. So that shows you in the 40s and 50s how much the publishers trying to approach the school and library market were chicken-hearted lily livers in even sometimes writing about what they were writing about. I also own a biography of Lincoln published in the 1940s by very noted children's authors that ends with Lincoln in his rocking chair, and the children never find out that Lincoln was assassinated. They took it out. It's too disturbing. So they wanted to end that the Civil War is over, the slaves have been freed, everything's good, the problems are over, and they didn't want to bring in the assassination. The visit to the south of the Bobbseys is going to equate the Bobbsey family that we're all familiar with a family that owns a plantation in the South, and the book is supposed to be a right now book. So it would be people owning a plantation in the South in around 1940. And we will see how this adventure with child appeal packed in unfolds in a book of that time. The Christmas book is going to be part of a tradition that goes way back of publishing happy books at Christmas that celebrate Christmas and try to include Blacks in various ways, the African Americans in these books. Here is Edward Stratemeyer, who invented the whole Bobbsey Twins series in 1904. He himself wrote the first 3 books, and after that hired ghostwriters to write all the rest of them. He invented the name Laura Lee Hope to be the author of all of them, and there is no Laura Lee Hope. So those of us who followed the series have been left guessing or will never know who wrote the books. The advantage of the syndicate inventing the series and carrying on the characters is A, they own the characters, and B, they don't pay royalties to an author. He would pay a flat fee of $75 to $100 to each author who was selected to write these books, which were going to be between 185 and 195 pages. The author of the book we're reading is attributed to be Elizabeth Ward, who supposedly wrote books 29 through 35 in this series. So she wrote these in the years leading up to 1942. One was about the Bobbsey twins going to be among Eskimos. One was about the Bobbsey twins visiting somewhere where they would encounter Indians. And once they had tried out those 2 minority populations, they were ready, I guess, to have Elizabeth Ward take the Bobbsey twins south. As you probably know, the Bobbsey twins are actually a northeastern kind of New England type family of the upper middle class. They have a driver, they have a cook, they go on costly vacations. They're not, I wouldn't say they are really a middle class family. The picture that you see on the right was a stock cover that was used for the Bobbsey twins books for a number of the first books. Here are all the pictures of women whose name was Elizabeth Ward. I have no idea which one of them might be Elizabeth Ward writing books in the 30s and 40s. It's possible the one in the middle, because she has a manuscript on her lap, is the one. But it underscores the fact that we will never know who wrote these books, even though they're among the most popular books on the American scene, as speaking of the series. Stratemeyer also created the Hardy Boys. He created Nancy Drew. He created other series that we haven't ever heard of, but were floated at the same time to see what would catch on and what he could do. Bunny Brown and his sister Sue is a completely different set of children, also attributed to Laura Lee Hope, and that series was tried out. Here's the Rover Boys, also authored by Stratemeyer. Horses and Cavalry are as popular as it gets. Nancy Drew was created by Stratemeyer and also authored by various pen names. Sometimes Stratemeyer would introduce the books with a note from himself, speaking about where that book fits in the series and trying to mention the other books that belong with the same characters. In other words, in the same way that Walt Disney owns Mickey Mouse, Edward Stratemeyer owned all these characters he had created. And he was not beyond sometimes trying to spin off products and other things that go along with the stories he was creating. Here we see the Hardy Boys. We see a book involving a battle, young people in danger on a dangerous river. Tom Sawyer. Well, Tom Sawyer is created by Mark Twain, of course, but we have Tom Swift and then Theodore Roosevelt, and anyone who symbolizes adventure is going to be possible grist for the mill in the Stratemeyer series. So this represents some of the innocent, beautiful, romantic looking pictures of the Bobbsey twins that were coming out between 1904 and the 1920s and 30s. Oh, now that's the end of this video. So let's go to the Bobbsey twins. We're going to come back to PowerPoint when we discuss the Christmas in the Big House, Christmas in the Quarters book. But let's pause now and take a closer look at the Bobbsey twins passage that you read that was circulated and see what you thought as you looked through it. And let me start first by, I'm going to stop share here, come back to my screen, and speaker view, and show you something from the Bobbsey twins 1941 book. I wonder if you can see this on the screen. Let's see, I need to have my screen up here. It starts off with Dinah, and she says, "Shows your live, we do keep a moving," cried Dinah as she climbed into the big depot wagon. Well, that's about as fractured as it gets on the old classic Amos and Andy type Black speech that became heavily criticized as being an example of white people writing what they conceived to be Black speech. Here is an illustration of Dinah that was in the 1941 book, and you can see the way that she is portrayed as she tells Freddie in this little passage, "This year circus won't move away from Dinah." And of course, the circus is going to move on, so she doesn't know what she's talking about. Then we have another moment in this 1941 book where we're going to run into Indians. "Look at our fort," called Bert to the girls. "We can shoot right through our battlements," he declared, and he sank down in the sand and looked out through the holes in the sand fort. "Shoot the Indian and you get a cigar," called Dorothy, taking her place as an Indian in front of the fort and playing target for the boys. First, Hal tossed a pebble through a window in the fort, and then Bert tried it, but neither stone went anywhere near Dorothy, the Indian. "Now mine turn," she claimed. All right, so this is, I have to say, realistic play of children in the 1940s. How many of us portrayed cowboys and Indians, a backyard game that everybody played? But is it appropriate to put this way in a children's book? I don't think so. I don't think you'd find it in a later age. Then we come to a beach scene where somebody's in trouble, and it says, "Just then a lifesaver came along," meaning a lifeguard. Freddie always insisted that lifeguards were not white people because they were so awfully brown from the sun, and really this one looked like some foreigner, for he was almost black. "What's the trouble?" he asked, seeing Freddie's distress. Just a casual reference to, well, lifeguards aren't white people because they have such a deep suntan. Man, they're almost black. A casual remark that just, it wouldn't appear. Do you agree with me? It wouldn't appear in that way in a children's book today. And I think that's enough, but you find casual references to minorities in these books that are kind of completely insensitive from today's standards. So now I'd like to share with you the cover that I think you had in your handout. It doesn't get any happier than the cover of this book. We have not a black person in sight. Just about the only cotton picking that's going to go on in the story is done by the white children. There's a little glimpse of the Negro workers on this plantation in 1940 picking the cotton, but it's not emphasized. It's definitely in the background. I'd like to hear some comments on the chapter that you read. For example, how well written is it? Does it sound like the Bobbsey twins that you remember? And what did you notice about the chapter that you read as they visit this plantation?
It is, as I remember the Bobbsey twins, which I think I read all of them, loved them. I don't know about the quality of writing. It certainly kept me engrossed as a young elementary student. It got me reading. There's a lot to be said for that. I think that I read the book Cast and was overwhelmed by the subtle things in my life that I just accepted. And so the things in this book or the TV shows that we watched all were part of an indoctrination of which I was totally blind to, even though I had been brought up to accept Black people, not to be prejudiced. And yet there are some elements within me that are there from these subtle things that I read as a kid.
Very
So
well said, really well said. I mean, I love the Bobbsey twins too. I mean, I think probably all of us read it. These writers really know how to get children on the page and keep things happening. Something happens and the dialogue is fun to read. And when we were that age, we thought it was a big deal to read a whole book ourselves that's 185 pages long. I mean, you have characters, you're reading dialogue. You didn't necessarily get that in school. School was more elementary, you know. And so we could be proud of the fact that when the next Bobbsey twin book came along, mom and dad would buy it, we'd have it at home. And it wasn't something you checked out of the library, was it? It was
No.
by the family, wasn't it?
Yeah,
So it's your book.
passed down.
Yeah, and passed down. And so, and handed around the family and maybe read more than once. I don't know about that. But when I was first going to do this class, I mentioned to my cousin Kathleen Verdine, who teaches at Hope, oh yes, Bert and Nan and Flossie and Freddie. She just, boom, right there. She knew all the characters and she remembered it just like that. And they're burned into our brains like Nancy Drew. It's not that Nan Bobbsey is so characterized that she's really a colorful character. Don't you think she's just kind of a girl we can identify with who's having adventures? And she's got a few more luxuries and privileges than we do. She lives at a little higher level than our poor family and so forth. So you could know how it is to be in somebody else's shoes like that. And just natural curiosity takes over and you get to go a lot of places and imagine a lot of things, which is exactly what Edward Stratmeyer was cashing in on as he chose these guest writers who knew how to do this. So as they come to the plantation, did you notice they were passing through historic country now? More than once, Mr. Bobbsey stopped the car so they might read the tablets on houses and in parks. It doesn't mention statues, but in a park, you would be talking about statues. These told of some stirring action during the Civil War or showed where some brave soldier had lost his life. Golly, I never knew we had so many heroes, said Freddie after one of these stops. America's a fine country to live in, isn't it, Daddy? Yes, indeed, and don't you ever forget it. Well, it says the words Civil War. But do you get any idea from this what the Civil War was? So I wonder now, from my adult point of view, whether a child reading this for the first time would stop and say, Mom, what was the Civil War? Now the parents got the question or problem of it, making a simple explanation to Trish or to me, what was the Civil War? And maybe that's the way the author wants it, because they don't know who's reading the book and who the child is and what the child might already know. But it's also possible this was heavily edited, and after much struggle, they took out anything anybody could say. They didn't mention a statue of Robert E. Lee, did they? They didn't mention that all the people in the Civil War were citizens of the United States, did they? What's a Civil War? Who was fighting and why did they die? Maybe the child doesn't even stop to think that.
I would not have stopped to think. I'm quite certain that I had read that and I went right over Civil War and went on with the story.
All right, so it's kind of, we're gonna put it in there, but it's not, it's not gonna say a thing about it. Okay. But as we know, statues are highly controversial, aren't they? Aren't we dealing with statues in public life today? Robert E. Lee was just taken down from, all of Charlottesville was about a statue of Robert E. Lee. Then we go a little farther, and a little Negro boy saw them coming. He stared open-mouthed for a moment, then scuttled around the back of the house, probably to give warning of their arrival. Now that little boy is going to turn up later as related to the theft of the precious heirlooms that the Percys have suffered in the first chapter. But the children reading this kind of know that there's a plot going on. Some heirlooms have been stolen from the plantation owners, and they're wondering what happened. And now this little boy looks shocked, and the child reading it will think, oh, I wonder what I bet that's going to be mentioned again. Why, they're up on page 109, and over there, said Mrs. Bobbsey, pointing the other side of the road, are the cabins of the plantation workers. Aren't they cute? Cried Flossie, bouncing back on her seat. She'd been standing up, but now she sat down kerplunk on Daddy, and Daddy Bobbsey turned the car into a broad drive leading to the house. Again, mention the cabins. Flossie sees them, says they're cute, and on we go. End of subject. Not another word about the cabins. Well, are the cabins of the slaves a hot subject when we're talking about the conditions of slavery and the restored plantations that are all over the South, and descriptions by different writers about the living conditions of in slavery times? But these are right now. This is in 1940. Now I wonder, Trish and all the others, when the readers read this in 1940, they realize the story is right now, right? Yes, the stories are all presented as happening right now. So the Civil War they're referring to is now 80 years behind the nation. It's over a long time ago. Do you think that by the time we were in, let's say, 3rd or 4th grade, prime Bobbsey twin reading age, we'd ever heard of the Civil War in school? I don't think so. Don't you think maybe 5th or 6th grade is going to be maybe the earliest that a class is going to mention the war?
I would say 7th grade. 6th grade,
Yeah.
we did Eastern Hemisphere. There was no history that I remember in 5th grade.
Okay.
So I would say middle school,
Okay.
before we learned really about the Civil War.
All right. So maybe elementary kids have not met the Civil War in school.
I don't think so.
Therefore, maybe parents in those days didn't sit around home talking to their kids about the Civil War.
No.
So it might be that Stratmeyer would be assuming, and these writers would be assuming, this might be the first mention of the Civil War that children would be ever finding anywhere. And so now, is that an implication if we say that the cabins are presented as cute? And that's a problem because the cabins were anything but cute. But let's get back to the cabins when we look at what Christmas in the Big House, Christmas in the Quarters is going to do with slave quarters and what's said about them. Now we come to what they're really excited about in this chapter, and that is that they get to ride ponies. And Colonel Percy, he's called Colonel Percy in the old antebellum tradition. Everybody was a colonel in the South. Colonel Percy, oh, aren't they beautiful, breathed Nan. Like them? Asked Colonel Percy, smiling. Like them, cried Nan. They're the prettiest little horses I've ever seen. I just love them. Are these Prince and Topsy? Asked Bert. The man nodded. And he has just introduced Jimmy. So Jimmy is the black groom who takes care of the horses. And he's pictured here in this illustration in the background. and not as definitively Black as Dinah was in the 1940 book. It's been lightened up, but it's still clear that he's a Black character. Colonel Percy had beckoned to the boy. Jimmy, he said, these are the Bobbsey twins. I want you to ride with them while they're at Great Oaks. Please fetch me Topsy and Prince. He's not introducing Jimmy as a person. He's just giving Jimmy an order, like ordering your appetizer from the waiter or something. It's just directions to an employee. That's all it is. It's not a personal introduction at all. And then Colonel Percy says a moment later, the horses belong to you while you're at Great Oaks. There's one condition, he added. You must take Jimmy with you whenever you ride, and he is your groom. He will be ready to go with you at any time you say. Wow. Wow. That's one of those things that we wouldn't even think anything of it reading it at the time. But now, looking back to see a young human being assigned to these children to be standing there 24/7, waiting to be called to be the groom anytime they want to go riding, it's wow, what a reminder of the white privilege that's at work here to be able to order a person around like that. And then later we do see them call Jimmy and bring him into the, now they talk about going to the cotton fields. And Colonel Percy says, tomorrow we'll show you the cotton fields. On their way to the house, the twins turned the corner of the bulky stone building. They almost ran into a familiar object. It was the trailer. This trailer has been the Bobbsey, it was stolen and the Bobbseys brought it down there. And so the trailer contained suspicious thing. It's going to be tied into the theft of the heirlooms. I wonder why it's standing here outside the garage. Probably too big to get inside, Freddie ventured to say. For some time, the Negro workers had been coming in from the fields. One of them, a young man, gave a startled grunt as he came upon the trailer unexpectedly. There was no mistaking his look of fear as his glance traveled from the vehicle to the Bobbseys. His jaw dropped open. With a sudden motion, he turned and made off down the road as fast as he could go. Now, what is the matter with him? Said Nan wonderingly. He acts scared to death. Probably afraid of the trailer, said Colonel Percy. I doubt if Rasty ever saw one before. So you have now met Rasty, the Black Negro worker, young man, who is going to turn out, can you guess, to have stolen the heirlooms? Well, what kind of a plot do we have here? And how do we look at it today, that you're going to write a book for children where they go to a plantation environment and lo and behold, something is missing. And it's explained in the chapter that when the Percys discover the theft, they don't expect anyone on the plantation. They don't think any of their workers would steal anything. Nevertheless, the heirlooms are gone. So they call the sheriff. And the first thing the sheriff does is bring his men and search all the homes of the Negro workers. Wow. And, you know, looking back, we say, wow, that's white privilege. I can just call my underlings here and they'll come ripping into all these homes of the Negro workers and take everything apart and rip it apart looking for heirlooms that the master is missing. Colonel Percy is called master here. Are the Negro workers still calling the plantation owner massa here in the 40s? It's unbelievable, but he is called master in this book. So in a way, there's really not a marked difference between the world of slavery as it would have been and the world that these Negro workers live in now. But the story is being presented as just the way things are. So now, for some time, the Negro workers had been coming in from the fields. One of them, a young man. Okay, that's Rasty. Now, what does the name Rasty sound like to you? To me, it sounds like a combination of rascal and nasty. So is Rasty going to turn out to be a nasty rascal? Yes. And he's going to be nabbed. And Bert and the Bobbseys are going to be part of the detective work, finding out who stole the heirlooms, because there's a little detective thread in every one of the Bobbsey books. And here's a late picture showing Rasty running away into the woods as Bert and one of the adults are, looking for him. Now they soften it because Rasty was pulled into this by a terrible, evil white guy who had pulled Rasty into his group and taught these young boys to be thieves. So it's blamed on a white man who pulled Rasty into the wrong path. But is the child reader absorbing a world where white privilege is just what Trish said, absolutely knitted in and taken for granted in a way that a later age is going to think of as, wow, that's amazing. Now, Wally took the time to read this whole book. And so, although most of you haven't read this and probably won't be dying to read the entire thing, let me hear some comments. Wally, what did you feel about these types of things I'm pointing out about the assumptions of the book?
Thank you for letting me speak a little bit. I can mention a couple of things I noticed. First of all, the impression of the white family, the Bobbsey family, is not only they're wealthy, but they are very, very much like forgiving parents. They never seem to punish their own children for anything. Like Freddie breaking the vase, or the mother just said, "Oh, get it repaired." But most of the times, when we're growing up, at least in my culture, we got a licking for that. The other thing I want to point out is that in chapter 2, Dinah, the cook, and so forth, and the husband of Dinah was the handyman driver. And then they follow with the 2 pets. They are lumping the blacks together with the animals.
Yeah.
That is kind of that very low way of comparing in the same paragraph. And I thought that's not very nice. And then they have this bully. The name is Rugg, Denny Rugg. Rugg and Rusty, all these R words are ruffian. So I guess maybe that's the way they try to use these words to describe a bad white person.
Mm-hmm.
They did the same thing in the Scarlet Raiders. Same thing. The bad guy is also start with R.
Yep.
So I think maybe back in those days, anybody with the first name start with an R are bad guys.
Or
I don't know.
Rug sounds like a thug, or just sounds like sounds like an ugh. It just
Ugh, Rug. Yeah.
All right. Good thoughts. Yeah. I noticed too that the Bobbsey parents are very permissive toward their children.
Very permissive. Yes.
So maybe in a way, the books are trying to model a more modern type of parenting where children who do get a licking get a vision of a family where things aren't that way. And the parents correct their children in this book, but they're extremely gentle about it, aren't they?
I thought Benjamin spoke, the doctor who encouraged lenient parenting, was not alive at that time. How did that quickly got into the situation here, the way the parenting is going on.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was a kid, you do something wrong, you get a licking. I'm not sure most of you guys have the same experience or not, but normally we don't get away with things, especially when we misbehave in a very, very awkward way. That my parents got embarrassed. They would not put up with.
Yeah.
I think we read those books. I read those books and I thought, well, I like those parents because that was not what I got. And so maybe you think I'm going to be like them when I grow up. I don't know.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Because they're not anything goes. They're not,
No.
they do correct things.
They
but-
do correct, but very nicely, and
Yes.
that they didn't get sent to their room.
Not
I
very,
think that's enough what I have to say.
all right, all right.
I'm gonna mute
And
myself.
the Bobbsey twins can always get out of their predicaments. They always get out of their predicaments. Of course, that's what a story is for. But there are episodes of the Bobbsey twins where, you know, they really do risk their lives. Really, they want to get them lost in the woods and lost and, you know, disappearing in the waves and losing sight of somebody underwater and starting fires. They'll have very dangerous things happen and then just gradually get them out. That's part of having the adventure plot, but it's risky. Any other comments on the Bobbsey twins? If not, we'll move on to the Scarlet Raider. Now, I circulated online part of the plot summary for the Scarlet Raider, and then a little bit of the dialogue in the Scarlet Raider as the main character, Tim Morgan, is hiding out in some bushes with some of his buddies, and they're actually being shot at by Yankees. And you see a little scene on those 2 pages that I circulated where Yankees and rebels are shooting at each other, and presumably people are dying in this scene. You don't see anything bloody, and he doesn't get shot, but they're discussing, you know, what the war really is. So what did you all think about what you could see in the plot and the story of the Scarlet Raider? First of all, making a hero out of a teen who fought for the Confederacy. Authors can write what they want. I mean, this is fiction. So I personally have no objection to authors writing books like this, where a teen fought for what I consider the wrong side in the Civil War. You don't have to be so protective in books for children that they never encounter anybody who was a Confederate. As they get older, they'll read books set in the Civil War and historic fiction of this type. But to put the child in the shoes of Tim Morgan. Wally, what would you say is the age group of pretty much boys who would read this book?
I would say there would be kids that are 12 years or older will read that kind of books.
Yeah.
Usually boys. I don't think girls would be attracted to this kind of a book. I think it's a very well-written book, and it shows the ugliness of war. Brothers killing brothers, essentially.
Yes, he does. And as you look at the credits of the author, you know, he was in the US military. He knows war. He knows exactly what's involved. He's very skilled in describing the actual moves and maneuvers of the soldiers in the war with considerable detail, which is correct. There's a rule of thumb that children like to read about somebody about 2 years older than they are. And sure enough, Tim Morgan is 14 in this book. And he is himself associating with teens who are a little bit older than that. So he's
15.
Yeah,
he was
15. Yeah, he was 15. Yeah. I don't actually know if Tim Morgan was based on a specific historic character. I don't think so. But of course, there are historic characters woven into the plot, including Mosby himself, who was real, and some of the generals.
Yeah, Stewart. That's real too, I think. I'm not a Civil War expert, but I think if you look at the American tradition, is that in the last 50 years, what have Americans been involved in? What wars did we fight? Korean War, Vietnam, Grenada. What else? I mean, we never really stopped fighting. Is there something wrong with us? Is a fighting spirit always in us that we need to fight to survive? Or can we just love each other and live? This is what Christ taught us, to love each other, love your enemies. We're not doing that.
with this book coming out in 1961, it would be reflecting a world where the parents of the kids reading this would vividly remember World War II
World War II and the Korean War.
and the Korean War.
Vietnam War was just starting. Only the French were fighting at that time. The Americans were not in there yet.
Mhm. And we could assume that the readers of this book, being 12 to 14, have encountered the Civil War in school, have learned something about the Civil War. They should be in 6th to 8th grades. And Brian Eisenhower was a rear admiral in the US Navy, retired. And he wrote a number of at least 6 other books about submarines, about exploring the Antarctic, Man Against the Unknown, and taking explorers and soldiers into foreign territory. In
May
this,
I,
book, yeah, go ahead.
when you say that children 12 to 14 reading this book for the first time in the 60s would have known about the Civil War, depends on which state they went to school. I was still in Florida at that time, and I didn't know about the Civil War until college. Honest.
Oh, that's not bad, Donna. That's good. I have an English friend. He has a PhD in physics. He didn't realize that the Britons were selling opium in China. And he denied that they would do a thing like this because he was never taught.
Yeah,
Never taught their own history. Yeah.
it didn't show up, but it also makes me remember quotes that, you know, only the victors get to write the history books.
Exactly.
Mhm, mhm. So any other reflections on where you encountered the Civil War growing up, in school or otherwise? How and where you got some knowledge? Did you have if you had a high school teacher who was all eager about describing Civil War battles and discussing war strategy and the ins and outs of war, you might become familiar with the Civil War. I seemed to have teachers who were interested in teaching that. And it seems to me that we were introduced to the Civil War in 5th and 6th grades by teachers. But maybe that was rare.
I went to Gettysburg when I was 5 years old, and then we got a bunch of Civil War soldiers. So my first book report in 1st grade was on the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
At the time, we didn't know that our great-great-grandfather Wesley fought for the Union side because of family breaks, but my father figured it out later.
How about that? So you got some toy soldiers that you bought at Gettysburg when you were 1st grade.
No, we got hats at Gettysburg, and then the
Hats.
toy soldiers came for a big joint Christmas present for the 3 little boys. We all got
Oh,
one. Very economical.
so then at what point did you sort of study the Civil War or have teachers really get you into it?
Oh, like I said, I did my first book report on it, and then we discussed it in elementary school some, and then I had American history in high school and in college and was a history major, and I'm actually writing a book about my great-great-grandfather, so I'm very deep in the
All right.
Civil War now.
All right. And who fought for the Union? So where did he fight and where was he from?
He was an Ohio kid who signed up at age 21 because his nephew was signing up, and I think he signed up to protect him, and his nephew got killed at Chancellorsville. And they were at all the big battles with Stonewall Jackson, Gettysburg and Chancellorsville and so on. And he lived. He got wounded twice, but he lived, and obviously I'm here, so he must have lived.
Very interesting. Well, the teaching of the Civil War has been the subject of huge battles among American teachers and people who buy textbooks for high schools, as maybe some of you realize, there was a long period of time in the 50s and 60s and 70s when it was just absolutely forbidden, especially by the southern states, to say that the Civil War was caused by slavery or was principally related to slavery. You were to say that it was because of economic and social differences between the North and the South, and that was the only acceptable interpretation. And any of you who have been teachers may have encountered high school and maybe grade school history textbooks which have to navigate the presentation of the Civil War to satisfy the demands of all the different states that feel that they best know what was really important and what the Civil War, quote, really meant. And so my son is a traveling substitute teacher sometimes in California and in different schools. And so I've sat down with the history books that he's teaching from today in advanced history classes. And the history books are fascinating to look at because to me, to my eye, they've been quite controlled in what they're supposed to say.
We were camping in northern Florida probably 4 years ago, and they were having Civil War reenactments in an area nearby, and the campground hosts were from Minnesota, and they asked us if we had been to the reenactments, and we had just arrived and so had not. And they said, well, they had gone and were watching the battle and were amazed when the Union soldiers were killed. Everyone cheered because they were in Florida. So the Civil War is alive and well in the South still.
Well, the Confederate flag never made it to the White House until recently, as we all know.
Yeah.
And, in Ohio, where I taught, the Confederate flag was all over the back seats of the cars of some of the students who were in the college. By the time they got to college at the University of Cincinnati and realized it was not the cool thing to have the Confederate flag on your back windshield, they kind of disappeared after they got used to coming to college for a while. But there was a very, very strong Southern sympathy and antagonism. Well, you know, I did tell you, didn't I, that the first chapter of this book is entitled All Yankees Must Die. That's the name of the first chapter. And so it's going to pull kids in to say, oh boy, let me see what this is all about. But there is such an outbreak today of white supremacist groups that are carrying Confederate flags and still fighting the Civil War that you can honestly say the Civil War isn't over in some very serious ways. And the KKK is alive and well in many parts of the country. There's a concentration of KKK between Dayton, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis. That's intense.
Mhm.
Linda, may I interrupt?
Yeah.
Indianapolis. When I walked downtown Indianapolis about 20 years ago, I saw a plaque that said, this is where the Ku Klux Klan was formed. When I saw that sign, I quickly dashed back to my hotel and stayed inside.
Yeah.
Wow.
I didn't know Indianapolis was the
Wow.
founding site. for the
Well,
Ku
I
Klux
think that's contested. That's, you know, I recently participated in Fred Johnson's class about Black Wall Street. And he gave a little description of the KKK. And I'm pretty sure he thought the KKK was formed in either Tennessee. I believe he cited something in Tennessee. So it's probably disputed among the different, you know, subgroups or.
I'm sure they are very divisive people. They probably will fight among themselves.
It was Confederate soldiers who started the KKK.
We were in Bloomington, Indiana in 78, and the KKK marched around the courthouse
Yeah.
in robe. And Martinsville, north of Bloomington, close to Indianapolis, was one girl selling magazines was murdered one night when she knocked on the door. She's a Black girl trying to sell magazines, and she was killed. That's very recent in my mind.
Okay, so you have the equivalent of a lynching still
Mhm.
going on.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, I went ahead and Googled the KKK, and on December 24th, 1865, in Pulaski, Tennessee, it was founded. But
that's,
maybe it's the northern branch is founded in Indianapolis,
yeah,
or could be the state, could be the statewide and KKK.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yes. Yes. Well, as we're testifying, the KKK groups are there in Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio. It's not strictly a Southern thing.
Yeah,
at
there was
all.
an Indiana town that was taken out, just like I sat through Fred's presentation too, and just like Tulsa was wiped out, there was another Indiana town just leveled, the whole black section of town. So it's a pretty racist place.
Now, what was the date of the Tulsa of the, that was 1921.
21, yeah.
It was
Yeah.
1921, yeah. But there were burnouts like that, as Fred Johnson was making clear. The Tulsa burnout that's called Black Wall Street was only one of many instances of white mobs burning a whole town and many people being killed in a whole community being destroyed. So that's going on while these kinds of books are being written, where the white people just say, oh, well, I didn't think a lifeguard was a white person. He's practically black. He's so dark.
I can tell you one thing about my grandson's experience. He lived in Boston, so they would go to McDonald's. There's always these black teenagers serving food there. And one time we went south and we went into a McDonald's, and he was surprised that there was a white kid serving him. And he turned around, looked at us, and said, there's something wrong. I said, no, no, no. He said, there's something wrong. He said, it's supposed to be a black kid working. You know, this kind of behavior is fairly, pretty much because you grew up with that and you think that's the way they do it. You stereotype people, which is terrible.
Yeah.
Unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, are there any other comments about the Scarlet Raider, about the plot that we saw here, where the motivation for Tim Morgan is revenge against the
Revenge.
Yankees? His view of the Civil War is that the Yankees invaded the South in order to destroy their way of life. That's his belief about what the Civil War was. And that the South now has a right to pay back the Yankees. There's not a single mention of slavery in this book. There's very little mention of even the Union, that it is the Union they're fighting, not just the Yankees against the rebels. And it's really quite disturbing, the kind of clan mentality that is behind the motivation of Tim Morgan. Although we must say that in the end of the book, Tim Morgan decides that some Yankees are okay. Well,
Sarah,
step toward brotherhood. His idea is a step toward brotherhood, the understanding between opponents that will be the hope of resolving what was really at stake in the Civil War, but nothing about the fate of the slaves or the involvement of that, of race as a subject of the Civil War. Let's move to the Christmas in the Big House, Christmas in the Quarters, because ideally we would like to think that by 1994, when Christmas in the Big House, Christmas in the Quarters was created by Patricia McKissick and her husband, Frederick McKissick, that we now have an enlightened book that touches on the slavery in the South and takes us to a happy Christmas that we can share. So let's take a look at this. So here is part of the cover of, let me see. Now I want to go to the presentation mode here. Let me see.
Do you need me to come in?
Yeah, because I'd like to maybe,
Put it in presentation mode. I'll be right in.
okay, yeah. If I can just get the screen sharing stop here.
Do you want to stop share?
No, I want to see a larger image of what I'm looking at. Maybe that's, oh, there, that's good. Now I can use this. All right, so this is part of the, what you're looking at now is part of the back cover of the book, showing the plantation that's going to be featured in our story. And a slave is bringing a Christmas tree toward the big plantation house. And here is an image of the slaves and the slave quarters. Now these cabins look something like a cross between Heidi's cottage in the Swiss mountains and Little House on the Prairie. True, they don't have any windows except a tiny one here and there, but they do have chimneys and they don't look like a complete hovel. Here's the image of Christmas that appears on the cover. It certainly looks like an image of the one big happy family of slavery. It is specifically portraying 1859, the year before Lincoln was elected in 1860, and of course the last year before the time when the Civil War was underway. And here is another image that's part of the cover of the white family in Civil War dress and two buildings in the background. Not sure that the more background image is, but it's called Great Oaks Plantation. I mean, you see the great oaks that are a mark of the plantation. The authors have an extensive note to begin the book, and you can think of this as an apologia, a defense of themselves. The big house is awash with light and color. Elegance and beauty dazzle your eyes at every turn. There's plenty of food and warm hospitality, but the people seem uneasy. Listen to their conversations. They're talking about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, slave insurrections, secession, and possible war. Now, take a walk to the slave quarters. There is no grandeur here. The wretchedness is staggering. People live in cramped one-room cabins with dirt floors. Yet there's a celebration going on, eating, singing, dancing. Does this mean the slaves are happy and contented? No. Listen carefully to their songs and stories. They are mostly of the hope that freedom is coming. Holiday revelers have no way of knowing that an era is coming to a close. Within 5 years, the slaves will be free and the plantation system destroyed. Their way of life will be changed forever. Christmas in the Big House, Christmas in the Quarter is a true account of this last Yuletide celebration before the Southern Rebellion. Does not say the Civil War. The events and customs we describe in the book are historically accurate. The conversations and dialogue are real, so is the setting. However, everything we use could not and would not have happened on one plantation. For this reason, we recreated a big house and quarters based on real people, events, and places located in Virginia, 1859. Why Virginia? Because the Jamestown colony is where the first American Christmas was observed and where many of our present holiday traditions began. Remember, while you're reading this, is more than a seasonal account. It is a story of a region and its people on the eve of war. When that war ended, the great plantations were never the same. Is this fiction or nonfiction? Have they made a sufficient for teachers and readers defense of claiming that this is a nonfiction book? that all the events and scenes are true. Let's go through it and see what the problems might be. Christmas is coming. The crops have been harvested and sold, the fields laid by till spring, the days have grown shorter and cooler, and the nights come faster and last longer. Then comes the morning of the first frost. To the child in the big house, the world appears covered by a lace tablecloth as delicate and fine as one on Mama's dining table. To the child in the quarters, the woods and fields are in the season of rest, comfortably sleeping inside a gauzy cocoon until it is time to wake again come spring. And then this picture of the slave cabins. Now, as I go through the pictures, I will read you selections from the text. We can't read the whole book, but you'll get the idea of taking you through the story that has just begun. Here in the big house, the slaves are scrubbing the floor. There's a lot of cleaning going on, and a beautiful illustration shows them from above on the beautiful floor in the house. The rugs are rolled up, taken outside, and beaten dust free. Mattresses are turned. 2 weeks before Christmas, the big house is ready, sparkling clean, fresh smelling, polished to a dazzle. Working on the big house from sunup till sundown doesn't leave much time for the slaves to see after themselves, but late in the evening, when the day's work is over, and early in the morning before the day's work begins, the slaves make the quarters ready for the big times too. Fathers stuff cracks with rags to keep out winter winds, and the stone fireplaces are shored up good and strong. Mothers start smiling, humming all the time. Children start minding their elders, doing their chores without being told, like sweeping the common yard and their own cabin floors. So this is the mother sewing here. When it is morning, but not yet daylight, an old slave woman goes gathering in the woods. Sometimes the children from the big house and quarters go along. So we're going to see an illustration where children from the big house and the quarters go together into the woods before dawn, following an old slave woman. I doubt it. I doubt it. Not the white children from the big house getting up before dawn and going off into the woods with the slave woman. I don't think so. Oh dear, I don't have all of the pictures here that I thought I had. All right, well, we'll go through these and then I'll show you a few more. Here's an image of the dinner being served in the big house. Certainly that seems authentic enough and care has been taken. Here's a slave storyteller with the children in the slave quarters. Is there anything questionable about this picture? The fireplace is quite dim. There's great dispute about whether and where there were fireplaces in the slave quarters of anything that you could be calling a fireplace or a chimney. The children are barefoot, but according to Frederick Douglass, the clothing on the slaves is absolutely and completely, incredibly way too luxurious. Children would not have been appearing like this in any slave quarters in the South. Here, a slave father in a vest and shirt with big puffy sleeves and a collar and buttons and all this is taking the height of his daughter, who's wearing a very pretty little dress, all tailored and gathered and plenty of fabric. And she has no shoes, but he has shoes. And then here is again, slaves and master gather around the tree, and as if they are together around the tree. Here are the children pinning their stockings over the slave fireplace. Now, there's no mantle, so that's accurate enough. They seem to be just putting them on a nail or something. But children, according to Frederick Douglass, were not issued stockings at all. the children had no stockings. And the children, according to Frederick Douglass, on a plantation, were issued 2 linen shirts per year that would come down to their knees, and that's it. There would be no underwear, there would be no socks, there would be no shoes for children. It would be a linen shirt, and that's all. This text is claiming that these children can be dressed like this by parents, their parents sewing from fabric they got from the master. Not believable. And they're wearing stockings just like you might see on any American children of that time. Again, the clothing here is including coats and vests and gathered material and a great deal of material and shoes, although here is barefoot. And here is a picture of what is claimed to be the slaves, including the field hands, coming to the big house on Christmas morning, and then they would present a gift to the mistress. Okay. On a plantation of this luxury, the question would be, how many acres would you have to plant in cotton in order to support a plantation of that size? Well, hundreds. The Shirley plantation, one of the restored plantations in the South, was 700 acres. And a rule of thumb was you need 1 slave for every 10 acres. So the Shirley plantation would have had to have 70 field hands in addition to whatever house slaves they have. Yet this text set in 1859 is claiming that the field hands came into the big house. 70 field hands came into the big house dressed like this. Well, maybe these are just the house slaves. Well, the text doesn't say that. The text says that all the slaves in the family. Here's the master sharing his violin with the slaves so that the slaves can have a jolly Christmas. And they're told that the violin has to be taken care of, but the master sharing his violin with the slaves is a serious illustration in this book. And then here's an image of the master's Christmas dinner, which is believable. These 2 servants plus the cook coming in with the roast turkey. And then here's the slaves' Christmas dinner. Again, the slaves are in clothing that is absolutely 100% completely impossible at this level of fabric and luxury for the slaves that we know about or that we can document from any plantation that would have been, unless you're only talking about house slaves, but they're portraying that they're talking about field slaves. I suspect that when this art was prepared, the editors and their experts were concerned about just what I'm talking about. And my suspicion, I have no proof, but my suspicion is that that patch on the back of that coat, which is particularly unbelievable, was added to the illustration. It could just be superimposed so that you pretend that, oh, well, this is a master's old coat that this particular slave has. We know that this slave would never have a piece of clothing like that, so we'll just put a big patch on it to make just a tad more believable that this is the way they were dressed. And the abundance of food is quite impressive. And of course, this is portrayed outdoors because they wouldn't want to take the trouble of portraying what the inside of a cabin must have looked like. A 1-room cabin in which multiple families would be sleeping, not on mattresses, but on the earth. And according to Frederick Douglass, there were no mattresses. He never had a mattress until he was 9 years old and went to Baltimore. Slept on the ground, on the dirt floor with just a blanket or a pile of straw or something. Nevertheless, here are some slave children with a lot of bedding, a mattress, pajamas and nightgowns, and a quilt, no less, like you would see in a pretty high level white household. Dreaming of freedom. Yes, the slaves are dreaming of freedom, but the conditions in the quarters are completely and totally ridiculous for this illustration. Then here's the master's New Year's Eve ball with the masks and the clothing that is believable and accurate for the period. And here is the slaves dancing their dances, all with aprons. And again, the men with suit coats and vests and a bowler hat. There's that same suit coat with the patch on it again. Chairs. Now we come to New Year's Day, and here's what it says about New Year's Day. It is known that on New Year's Day on the plantation, those slaves who had been sold during that year would find out about it on New Year's Day. And so here's the text for this illustration. And if we assume that it's the Shirley plantation, now many plantations were way bigger than 700 acres. But if it had 700 acres, therefore 70 slaves, then here's what would be the text. Slave and master pay close attention to traditions and superstitions on New Year's Day. They both believe a bad move can seal your fate for the next 12 months. In the big house kitchen, the regular cook takes over. She fixes the first feast, no quarreling and so forth. And about noon, the plantation bell summons all the slaves to the front of the big house. The master gives each slave a conduct and work report. For 70 slaves plus the house slaves. You're too lazy, you're too slow, you're a hard worker, a fine example of a good slave. Then Massa calls the names of those who have been sold or hired out. His voice shows no emotion. Okay, well, that sounds fairly brutal, but no sense in screaming, mother. Your daughter is 12 years old enough to be the body servant of a fine lady over in Richmond. You'll get to see her next Christmas. Begging, crying, pleading, changes nothing. Massa's decisions are final. He goes back into the big house. The slaves go back to the quarters and say their farewells. This is the way it is. The big times are over. Sadness replaces happiness in the quarters. There is no heart for singing and dancing. Separation is almost too painful to bear. Goodbye, so long, be seeing you. How much longer can it go on this way? How long, O Lord, how long? Come nightfall, the families in the big house quarters watch as the Christmas tree is taken out and burned. And so here's the tradition of the Christmas tree being burned. Then in the big house, Pa, the master's daughter, whispers, for Christmas next year, I want my own personal slave. All my cousins have one. He laughs, but you're just 10 years old, darling. You don't know the first thing about owning a slave. Maybe when you're 16, all grown up and a fine lady, then you'll know how to be a good mistress. That's 6 whole Christmases from now, the daughter says. And then we go ahead to the division in the quarters where the young boy is hoping to run away. Next year, when the big times come, I'm going to give you a store-bought gift. The mother smiles. How so? I'm going to run away to freedom. Hush, she says, covering his mouth to silence him. Talk like that will get you in trouble. Besides, she adds, smiling, the way talk is going, I got a feeling we ain't going to need to run away. One day soon, we're going to celebrate the big times in freedom. And that's the end of the book. Now, I must say, when I first saw this book, I was so offended by what I thought were the glossing over of the reality of the field hands and the way they lived, knowing as I do the life of Frederick Douglass and what he wrote about, that I was very negative about this book. However, I do think that this final scene where the master is busy promising his daughter that she'll have a slave of her own when she's 16, and meanwhile, the young man in the quarters is promising his mother that very soon, within the next few years, he's going to run away. And she says, maybe we'll be free by then. Now, I'd like to hear some comments about this. We have about 15 minutes left, and I'd love to hear how you feel about this book now that you've seen it. There are 2 copies of this on reserve at the Herrick Library in case you'd like to look at it more closely. Did any of you have a chance to do that, or is this your introduction to the book?
This is an introduction, but I know that the authors are both Negro
Yes.
or African American, and they received a Coretta Scott King Award for this book,
They did. That's right.
which is an ambiguous kind of thing because it seems like it's slanted. It doesn't seem to tell the story as I feel it, that
Okay.
I've learned from other things.
Yes. Well, elaborate on that a little bit. What especially did you see in the pictures or story that you thought was?
Well, the presentation is of the family as they are, which, you know, I don't see that holds true. And it washes over everything. So I don't feel it holds the things, but to have been taken a prize by a Black prize basically for the book took me aback.
Yes. I agree.
I think the book reflected society's expectations of how we looked at slavery, plantations, that period of time before the Civil War. And, you know, I don't know the authors. I'm surprised to learn that they were African American, but maybe authoring a book that was actually truly 100% accurate would not have been publishable even in the 90s.
For children, yeah.
Yeah. We don't, as a society, want to look at this dark side of our history, or even the way things are now. We really like to gloss over it. And I think it's reflected in our literature.
Mm-hmm. All right, so some others of you, what did you feel about this book as a representative of where the country was in 1994 in the ability to write a true Christmas book that would bring about a vision of slavery, a vision that was in any way touching on something? Frederick Douglass makes the comment that the master wasn't even at the big house on Christmas Day. The master had a house in Richmond, or a house in Savannah, or a house in some big city. Douglass says he wasn't at the big house on Christmas. He was enjoying the social season at his city house where everything was much easier. He might take a few house slaves with him for his holiday, but he wouldn't be on his farm at Christmas. I thought, well, that's interesting. Douglass also claims that the masters didn't even know the names of their slaves. Well, Douglass grew up on the plantation of Colonel Edward Lloyd. Now, he didn't directly belong to Lloyd. He belonged to Lloyd's under his overseer, Lloyd's overseer, a white man. He belonged to Aaron Anthony, who worked for Colonel Lloyd, but they lived on the Lloyd plantation. Colonel Lloyd had 28 different farms. His plantation, as a term, included 28 farms, some of them miles away from the home farm. And Lloyd was the governor of Maryland for 2 or 3 terms. The saying in those days was, God said no man should own 1,000 slaves, but Colonel Lloyd has 999. So Douglas says Colonel Lloyd wouldn't even know one of his slaves by sight. He didn't even know 20 of his slaves by name, maybe the house slaves he did. But the slaves he employed in the field, they had no names as far as the master was concerned, and they wouldn't even be recognized. So the implication here of a personal connection between the field hands and their master is a fiction. It's not there. How do you think this book would be received today in Black families who are going to be faced with bringing up their children with some knowledge of the Civil War and the slavery past of the country and so forth, and what life was like in the 1860s? Well, of course, you can't generalize about a racial group. It's a sign of racism to saying, well, Black people would feel this way or Black people would feel that way. That's a very stupid thing to say. It's a huge example of white privilege to feel the privilege of characterizing another group like that, another racial group, either your own or anybody else's. It's just white privilege to a sickening degree. So
Wouldn't there, what? Black families today received a version of the education I received. And so what is their knowledge of the reality? It's not any better than mine. Their reality of today and their role in our world is obviously very different. My sons don't face what a young Black man faces, but in terms of, would they see the fallacies in a book like this in today's, well, yeah, I don't know.
Uh-huh. The reviewers of this book, the reviews of this book are mixed. There were reviews that were very hard on the authors in the same ways that I was indicating, for glossing over many things and presenting many things that were just completely ridiculously impossible, like this little scene of the slave child presenting the mistress with a basket of eggs. That the book is straining and straining and straining to create these romantic little scenes of cheer and intimacy. So it did receive a lot of criticism, and they include a bibliography at the end, which is sadly wanting. Much of the research that was done here that's being quoted is from restored plantations. Well, who's doing restored plantations? Donors. Yeah, donors who are interested in tourist type history.
I went to African American Museum in DC, and of course learned so much. And there were 90% of the people there were of African American heritage, and they were learning as much as I was. There, oh my gosh, oh, look at this. It was exactly the same. And so, yeah, we see it, I don't know, I think they're in the same place we are on a lot of this history and the reality.
Well, do you think there's been a massive move in American education to either avoid the subject or write very romanticized books about it? One or the other. And even when children, quote, children are high school age, they're not getting something that we could justify as being historical, like reading the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass or reading some of the slave narratives to see what the slaves of that time were writing when they did have the ability to write about it. Or reading some of the more historically accurate biographies of some of the abolitionist leaders and of the history of those times. The amount, Trish, you're saying just the fact that, like, the museum in Washington, D.C. has to start at such a simple level of letting people know even the simplest things about what happened, what slavery was like, and facts about how many slaves there were, where they were, what the actual history of slavery entails, and therefore have a background to the Civil War. Let's see, who's the person who's writing the book about the grandfather? That's Thomas, isn't it?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. Any comments? What do you think here?
I don't think this is a very representative picture of slavery. I've read Frederick Douglass's biography, and he was actually the northern portion. So some of the conditions that he reports were even worse down south. If you were in a plantation that was
Yes.
on cotton.
Mm-hmm. Well, he's describing the Chesapeake Bay area, Maryland, where he grew up in Maryland. But that's considered northern slavery. You know, there's a kind of a mythology that the further north you go, slavery was milder, and certain states believed that their version of slavery in Virginia or Maryland was much more mild than the cruelty of Mississippi and Louisiana, where really bad things were happening. And that kind of mythology about our slavery is better than your slavery, and starting to do that version of defensiveness. So there's no question that trying to tell the history is difficult for people.
Now, slavery has been started years ago, before the Americans having slaves. You know, you talk about the Greeks, you talk about the Egyptians, these Israelites, they all own slaves. And it's because they have wars, they conquer the nation or conquer somebody else, and they put them into slavery. It happened in every culture. So slavery is not just isolated to just Black families alone. Unfortunately, in this country, that's the majority of the cases is slave system there. But you know, there are Chinese slaves, from the Taiping Revolution when it was defeated.
Yes.
All those people were shipped over to South America, become slaves.
The
Yes.
Bible has evidence of slaves in it too.
Correct.
Yes,
By
yes.
the Jewish
Slavery
people.
is a man's way to control another group of people that they conquer. You know, that's history tells you. I mean, I'm not for it or against it. I'm just saying that this is what happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
St. Patrick started out life as a Roman slave.
Yes, exactly.
I think our narrator, I'm not mistaken, is from Ohio. Is that right?
She is, yes.
Okay. My husband and I visited an island up near Clinton, Ohio, just traveling around and just driving around. We found an island. You had to get to it by bridge. It's near Lake Erie, and it's completely surrounded by deep and fast running tidal water, or just deep, fast running water. I don't know, but it was a prisoner of war camp for Confederate officers that were captured during the battles and brought to this island and lived there for 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
But they could bring their own slaves with them. And so on this island is a cemetery of those who perished for whatever reason, and a separate and unequal cemetery for their servants, slaves that they brought with them. But the island narrative is that even though they were captured prisoners of war, they could bring help with them, and they also could form a society. So they had livable houses. They were not imprisoned other than being on this island. They could have music. They could perform plays. They could live as if they were on vacation. And they had these Black servants that served them and perished along with them, either from old age or disease or
Wow.
whatever. And that island is not far from the big famous amusement park, whatever that's called in Ohio.
Oh,
Whenever
yeah, I
it
know
goes.
what you mean.
Cedar
I can't think
Point.
of the name of it now.
Cedar
Yeah,
Point.
Right. Mhm.
It's
So-
Johnson's Island. I just looked it up. It's located in Sandusky Bay of Lake Erie near Sandusky, Ohio, which is near Cedar Point.
interesting, interesting.
Never heard
Very
of it.
interesting. Well, I think we are running out of time here. It's a little after 2:30. I know Wally has someplace he needs to go. So I want to thank everybody who contributed here. The books will still be on reserve at Herrick Library for a couple more days if you wanted to look at them again and think about what we've talked about. I really appreciate all your comments, and thank you, Wally, for
Thank you, Linda. And
Reading
thank
everything.
you for all for participating. And I want to thank Linda for doing a very good job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Everybody
All right.
have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.